2. We start with Jehu and go to Hosea, so we know we're in for an interesting sermon, right? It's good to be with y'all this evening. It's so good to be with y'all. It's been quite a few months, I feel, since Jessica and I have been able to worship with you, but Dorothy, of course, keeps us updated on what's going here, and it seems that this has been a good year overall for this congregation. I'm grateful that God has continued to bless you and that you continue to walk in Him, and that this year, hopefully, will be a year of even more increase and more growth and more furtherance of the gospel here. I don't know about y'all, but when I think back to 2015 was just a weird year. I mean, whenever you look at the news, so often I go on Facebook and I follow so many news feeds, and I just start scratching my head thinking how weird the world has gotten. I mean, you go from everything from the Kim Davis fiasco to the Caitlyn Jenner, whatever you want to call it. We live in a weird world. I mean, we just live in a strange time. And perhaps these times are only going to get weirder. I don't know. I'm not a prophet. But I do know that there are certain characteristics of our age that are just weird. And sometimes whenever I look at what's going on, not just on the news, but what's around me as well, at work, and on campus, etc., there's a lot of things that are just weird. What I want to talk about tonight is this weirdness in a little ways. What I want to do this evening is go into the Old Testament and try to draw some parallels to the Old Testament times to our times. I think as we go into the Old Testament, as we begin to look at some of the trends that were occurring in Israel in the ancient days, we're going to see some parallels. Then what I want to do in about the last quarter of the sermon is I want to try to connect this to certain things that we as Christians are going to face today. I'll tell you at the forefront, the topic that we'll be talking about and we're leading up to is one of the greatest threats that I think my generation is going to have to face as Christians. It's something that Satan has become very clever about, but we're going to get there. So what I want to talk about from the Scripture this evening is removing the names of the Baals. So what we're going to do the first half is I want us to go into the Old Testament and look at Baal. Now, whenever you look at Baal or Baal, I don't know how you say it right. Bill thought I was talking about a jail bell this morning. But whenever you look at Baal, he is one of the most common gods of the Old Testament. But I will admit for myself, until I studied him, I didn't know a lot about him. So what I want to do is two things. I first want us to do a basic overview of him. And I mean basic. We're going to go fast. I want us to try to understand just his basic history, how he was involved with the nation of Israel, what his influence was, and ultimately how God viewed him. And then I want to try to answer, why was Baal worship so popular in Israel? Now, as we begin in Hosea chapter 2, beginning in verse 18, we're going to see here, in the very end of the nation of Israel, before they go into captivity, Baal worship was still very prominent. But I want us to use this as an introduction to see how God views Baal. Hosea 2, I want to begin in verse 13. Hosea 2, beginning in verse 13. And I will punish her for the feast days of the Baals, and she burned offerings to them, and adorned herself with her ring and jewelry, and went after her lovers, and forgot me, declares the Lord. Therefore, behold, I will allure her, and bring her into the wilderness, and speak tenderly to her. And there I will give her vineyards, and make the valley of Anchor a door of hope. And there she shall answer as in the days of her youth, as the time when she came out of the land of Egypt. In that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband, no longer call me my Baal. For I will remove the name of the Baals from her mouth, and they shall be remembered by me no more. And I will make for them a covenant on that day with the beasts of the fields, the birds of the heavens, the creeping things of the grounds. And I will abolish the bow with the sword and the war from the land. And I will make you lie down in safety. And I will betroth you to me forever. And I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice and in steadfast love and mercy. I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord. Now, the prophet Hosea speaks toward the end of the nation of Israel, before they go into captivity, particularly to the nation of Israel. And what Hosea calls out throughout the book is faithlessness. I mean, if you really look at the prophet Hosea, what he focuses on is this faithless relationship. And he sets up this marriage relationship even to show how the nation of Israel has been faithless to God. one of the direct causes of this faithlessness was Baal worship. We read in verse 17, I will remove the name of the Baals from her mouth, and they will be remembered for me no more. I will make a covenant on that day with the beasts of the fields, the birds of the heaven, creeping things of the ground. Baal worship and God were not equivalent and could not be fellowshipped in any way, shape, or form. One of the reasons that God was going to send his people into captivity, into the hands of the Assyrians, into the hands of the pagans, was because of Baal worship. So what we're talking about here is pretty serious stuff. Whenever God looked at Baal worship, this was immense, and it had true implications on the nation when they looked at Baal. It sends them into captivity, it causes them to sin, and ultimately it's going to be their downfall. Well, how did Baal get his start? As a note, whenever we see passages underlined, we're going to read those. If a passage is not underlined, it's just there for reference. But let's do a little overview of Baal. Baal himself was one of the chief Canaanite gods. So he was an ancient god. Whenever the children of Israel go into the land and they take Canaan back in the book of Joshua, Baal was there. Baal had been around for hundreds of years throughout the nation of Israel. And even before the nation of Israel was established with Moses and then with Joshua, Baal was then around. Baal himself was the god of storms, which led him to be the god of fertility. So you take from an ancient perspective, Baal, of course, was very important. If it didn't rain, the people didn't eat. If it didn't rain, they didn't have crops, and the nation didn't survive. That's perhaps one reason why Baal was so important. It adds another note to it then. When you go, we're not going to turn there, but when you go to 1 Kings 18 and you look at the prophets of Baal going against the prophets of Elijah, it adds another dimension to it. There you have them trying to have fire. You're trying to have this great storm to come about. Whenever it actually comes down, fire from heaven, most likely that was lightning. So what it's showing there is God himself can have the storm. God creates the storm. But the God of thunder, the God of storms, he can't even give thunder. He can't give lightning. So Baal himself was supposed to be the God of storms. Doesn't really do it. And finally, what we see with Baal here is his female partner was the Ashtaroth. So oftentimes in the Old Testament, you'll read of the Ashtaroth. Even in 1 Samuel 1 through 8, we read of Ashtaroth this morning. This is a picture of Baal. I know it's not overly clear, but if you'll look just a couple of notes about it, the head itself is gold, but the rest of the body is made out of much cheaper substances. Most likely what this means is that they were trying to give a level of respect to Baal by giving it gold, but the people were too poor to give it a full body of gold, so that's why they had to have the rest of the body of it. Now, whenever I put this up here, I know to most of us, this just seems like, some ancient artifact that you may see in the field museum or something. But y'all, I want us to recognize, people have bowed down before this. I mean, whenever we talk about Baal worship, can y'all honestly imagine for a moment, if I were to come down, to us that's ludicrous. But thousands and thousands of people have bowed before this. I mean, I don't know all the details of exactly when this particular artifact was found, but I can guarantee you, wherever it was found, thousands of people actually bowed themselves and gave their lives over to this thing. What to us is just ludicrous, people gave their lives to this. People dedicated their entire existence to this. So what to us may seem a little bit out of the ordinary, perhaps even weird, to use my term, it plagued the nation of Israel. Well, how did Baal get his start in the nation? I do want us to turn to Numbers 25. Numbers 25 tells us, to my knowledge, the first time that Baal worship is introduced to the people. Numbers chapter 25. We're going to read verses 1 through 5. While Israel lived in Shittim, the people began to whore with the daughters of Moab. These invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people yoked himself to Baal Peor. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And the Lord said to Moses, take all the chiefs of the people and hang them in the sun before the Lord, that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel. And Moses said to the judges of Israel, each of you kill those of his men who have yoked themselves to Baal of Peor. Now, I want to begin noticing some patterns. The first pattern that we see here is that people who are supposed to be theists in one God are already yoking themselves to many gods here. We read here that Israel, the nation of Israel, they were still wandering. They still hadn't established themselves, but they were wandering. They were living in this time in Shittim, but they began to whore with the daughters of Moab. And these people invited the sacrifices to their gods, and the people ate and bowed to their gods. So what was it that drew them to Baal? The people were drawn to Baal not because this idol was so magnificent, but you notice what brought them? The daughters invited the people to sacrifice to their gods. What first brought the people to Baal was not just an innate desire to worship before Baal, but what brought them to it was people, bad influences. Peer influence and perhaps sexual influence had caused the people to yoke themselves to a false idol. Second thing I want us to notice here is God takes this very, very seriously. We read in verse 4, Yahweh, the Lord, says to Moses, take all the chiefs of the people and hang them in the sun before the Lord, that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel. And Moses said to the judges of Israel, each of you kill those of his men who have yoked themselves to Baal of Peor. When the people fall into Baal worship, what was God's response? His response was, well, they didn't know any better. They were just blinded by a pretty woman. Bless their hearts. No, God tells them, you take the chiefs of the people, and you take them out in the sunlight, and you hang them. This is a very serious consequence. So whenever we look at the beginning of Baal worship, it began in the wilderness, but it's going to continue throughout the rest of the book. As we go into Judges chapter 2, we're going to read that Israel continued to worship during the time of the judges. Now, Baal himself only comes up a handful of times throughout the book of Judges, but he's still there. And you'll remember the book of Judges, that great cycle. There's many times they fall, many times they're good, many times God saves them. But Baal leads to that fall many times throughout the book. So while we don't read of Baal in the time of Joshua, throughout the book of Joshua, the people, except for the sin at Ai, are overall very faithful. But when we get to the book of Judges, Baal shows up again, and he's causing the people to sin yet again. And then as we go into the book of 1 Samuel, Samuel's called by the people to put away the Baals, and they did obey. So you'll get to this perhaps on Wednesday night, but Samuel recognizes Baal worship is still a problem. So the very beginning of the book of Judges, all the way to the very end of the time of the Judges with Samuel, Baal worship's a problem. So this God that we saw, this object, this thing, this God of storms, this God of the Canaanites, that the people bow themselves down before and worship before and give sacrifices before, he's always with them throughout the time of the Judges. It doesn't really go away. Well, continuing throughout the rest of the Old Testament then, as we go into 1 Chronicles chapter 8, this is something that I think is extremely interesting. Does anybody know who Mephibosheth is? Mephibosheth. Brother Bill, who's Mephibosheth? Who is he now?
He's a young man that was grandson of Saul.
Very good. That's right. Son of Jonathan. Now, who is Meribbaal? Has anybody ever seen Meribbaal before? Here's what's interesting about Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth, we read in 2 Samuel 9 through 2 Samuel 9 verse 6, and Mephibosheth is the name used throughout Samuel. Mephibosheth is the son of Jonathan. Now, what do we know about Jonathan? Jonathan was knit together to David. He was a holy man, a righteous man, a God-fearing man. Mephibosheth is a holy man, perhaps. His father definitely was. Jonathan names his son Mephibosheth. But whenever you go to 1 Chronicles 8, verse 34, Mephibosheth is not called Mephibosheth. He's called Meribbaal. This is the same person. Throughout Samuel, he's called Mephibosheth, but when you go to the book of Chronicles, he's actually called Meribbaal. Well, why? Bosheth in Hebrew means shame. Here's most likely what this means. Most likely, Jonathan, a holy man, actually named his son Merib-Baal, after Baal. Now, to what extent Jonathan was aware of this or was giving homage to Baal, I don't know. What it shows us is Baal was still very prominent throughout this time. In the best friend of David, who warns him and serves the Lord with him, names his son after a false idol. Bosheth, most likely, was put in later by scribes who just could not bring themselves to put the name Baal in the name of Jonathan's son. So what they did was they renamed him Mephibosheth, meaning shame, the son of shame. So whenever we look at what Jonathan would have called his son, Jonathan most likely would have called his son Merib-Baal. But the scribes later thought it was such a shame for Jonathan's son to be called Merib-Baal. They rename him, and then they call him Mephibosheth. So really, Mephibosheth is that scribe-given name, most likely. But it shows us again, he's evident. He's evident throughout the books. Continuing on then, as we get to 1 Kings chapter 16, Ahab is known, perhaps the one to introduce. Perhaps that's a misnomer. Ahab is the one who formalizes Baal worship in Israel. Then we get to 1 Kings 18. That's where we have that great battle of the prophets of Baal versus the prophets Elijah. And then again, Elijah asks God, send down fire. God sends down the lightning. And the true God conquers the God of storms. And you have that great victory of God there. But then, this isn't really the end of the story. We get to 2 Kings chapter 10. As Brother Tom read for us, Jehu wipes out Baal worship. Very clever. Jehu wipes it out. But that's not the end of it. Finally, when we get back to Hosea and Jeremiah, both prophets mention Baal. So even though Jehu wiped out Baal worship throughout the nation of Israel, when we get back to the time of Hosea and Jeremiah, Baal's still around. So what can we learn from this so far? 2 points I want us to make note of. The first is God took Baal worship extremely seriously. We read in Hosea 2, the punishment for Baal worship was captivity. Numbers 25, the punishment for Baal worship was death. Jehu killed the prophets of Baal and the worshipers of Baal. God took it very seriously. The second thing, though, is it seems to be almost always present throughout the nation of Israel. Now, while at times Baal was more prominent than others, he's always there. He always has some influence, and then in some way it is influencing the nation of Israel. Well, what in the world does this have to do with our times? Whenever we talk about Baal worship, I'll speak for myself. I don't see how any right-minded person could bow themselves before an idol. I mean, when I think back to that image up there, and I think of people sacrificing to that thing, I mean, it's just ludicrous. But then you have the people of God who saw His wonders, who saw His miracles, who saw His might. They leave the true God for Baal. It's a bit ludicrous. But the question that I pose is, why worship Baal? I mean, why in the world would the nation of Israel, who recognized the power of God, who recognized His covenant, who recognized that He was the one true God, why in the world would these people leave God to worship Baal? Well, 2 passages I want us to consider. Go with me to Judges 10. Judges chapter 10 and verse 6. Judges chapter 10 and verse 6. Judges 10, verse 6. The people of Israel, again, did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth, the gods of Syria, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of the Ammonites, the gods of the Philistines. And they forsook the Lord and did not serve Him. Keep your finger here. Go with me to 1 Kings 18. 1 Kings 18, we're going to read verse 21. 1 Kings 18:21. And Elijah came near to the people and said, "How long will you go limping between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow Him. But if it is Baal, then follow him." And the people did not answer him even a word. So why did the people follow Baal? Because here were their options. Baal allowed them many gods and many truths. God, Yahweh, Jehovah, says, I am the one God, the one way, the one truth. Notice again, let's read the text one more time. Judges 10. The people of Israel, again, did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and served the Baals and the Asheroth, the gods of Syria, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of the Ammonites, the gods of the Philistines. Stop there. 7 different sets of gods. Now, this doesn't even include all the specific gods. We have here the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, dozens of gods, but 7 different types of God. 7 different types. And they forsook the Lord and did not serve him. But Elijah tells the people, how long will you go limping between 2 different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. And the people did not answer him even one word. So, brethren, why did the people follow Baal? To use a 21st century term, Baal is inclusive, God is exclusive. The gods of the Ammonites, the gods of the Moabites, the gods of the Philistines, Baal, Ashtaroth, etc., they weren't exclusive. Baal says, if you want to worship me, that's fine. Give me your sacrifice, give me what you can, and then go and serve the gods of the Sidon. Then serve the gods of Moabites. Then serve the gods of the Philistines. And then perhaps, if you sow widely enough, then perhaps God will bless you. So if we put a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit there, perhaps one of all these gods is the real God, and they'll come to you. Many gods, many truths. But Elijah said, there's one God. There is one God. Either God, if he is God, then serve him. But if Baal is God, serve him. Either or. Baal says, serve both me and all the other gods. The true God says, serve either me or Baal. Jehovah's exclusive. Baal was inclusive. So why did the people serve Baal? It's because Baal didn't have a strict moral code. Baal was inclusive. Everybody got to serve the Baals. Everybody got to serve all the gods. Everybody got to do it. This other God's just mean. I mean, this is just an arrogant God. Jehovah's an arrogant God who thinks he's the only right one, who thinks he's the only real one, and he won't let us worship all the other ones. He's a mean God. He's a vindictive God. He's a cruel God. But Baal, he's not going to discriminate against these other gods. He's not going to demean these other gods. He's not going to put down these other gods. He'll allow any gods. Jehovah says me or everyone else. Baal says me and everybody else. So what then, y'all, are the parallels of this to modern day? Whenever I look at America, unless I've just missed it somewhere, I don't see in Indiana a large group of people bowing before Baal. But I do see people caught up in a similar mentality. And the mentality that I would call this is postmodernism. Now, this is a term, I know it may seem like a big term. I'm going to define it. But whenever I look at modern day Baal worship and how Satan has, in a way, reincarnated the same system of thought, the same mentality, and in many ways the same ideology to 21st century times, it is through the concept of postmodernism. Well, let me define my terms. Postmodernism essentially is the belief that there's no absolute truth. Postmodern. Now, I won't go into a lot of the philosophy of this, but modernism, the philosophy of modernism, ultimately claimed that truth could be found in nature. If you wanted to find truth, you looked to nature. That's why evolution had such a great, widespread account. Darwinists will claim there is one truth. There's a scientific, empirical truth. But the way to find that truth, it's in nature. It's in the empirical. It's in the tangible. But postmodernists then came along and they said, no. That's arrogant. How can we know that there's a truth? Even if there is one truth, how can we know that we know that one truth? And so then this led to the idea that there's just no absolute truth. And furthermore, what it claims is if there's not absolute truth, there's only personal truths. If it's your If it's what you want, if it's what you desire, it's what you get. Again, God is exclusive. Baal was inclusive. Baal says, you can serve me and everyone else. No one has to be more right than any of the rest of us. We can all just coexist. God says, I am the one true God. You will serve me or you will serve the other gods. Christianity says, John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. Postmodernism says, create your own way. Create your own truth. Create your own life. Anyone can go to the Father any way that they please, so long as they're true to themselves. And so the true God of postmodernism is not some object. The true God of postmodernism is self. Because anything that makes my own way, anything that makes my own truth, anything that makes my own life, it exalts me. And it makes me the God of my own life. But as we continue on with the concept of postmodernism, Baal again, choose your own God. Postmodernism, choose your own truth. One way that I would say that we can see this is looking at the lack of structure. I'm going to explain this here and again in a second. But I think one of the most evident indicators of postmodernism in 21st century society is just the absolute lack of structure. Again, God says there's a truth. There's a way that things should be. It's given in His law. That's the way it is. Postmodernism says, create your own truth, create your own way, create your own life. Whatever makes you happy, just do it. Just be true to yourself. And then we lose structure. Well, I want to illustrate this with a few visuals, and then we're going to bring this to the spiritual. First of all, I want you to get in your mind what a playground should look like. Okay? What should a playground look like? Whenever you think of a playground, the ones I went to growing up, there were some swings, there was a couple of slides, there were things you could bounce on, things you could climb on. But, almost all the ones I went to were pretty similar. Some were bigger than others, some had different colors, but they were all pretty much the same, a similar structure. Well, let me show you what a postmodern playground looks like. What's a postmodern playground? Jared, Landon, when y'all go back to FC, I want y'all to do something. As you walk down, what's the road? Glenarvan. As you walk down Glenarvan, my first 2 years that we were at FC, there is Dark Park. And there is a old school playground there. A slide, a swing set, all that good stuff. But in my third year, Jessica and I were walking by it one day. And I just stopped, and they had something very similar to this up. And so we went over, and we jokingly went over with our friends, and we tried to play on it and climb on it. I had no earthly idea what I was supposed to do. If you see a swing set, you get on the swing and you swing. Whenever you see a slide, you go up to the top of the slide, you go down it. If you're really, really ambitious, you climb up the slide. Woo. But that's what you're supposed to do, right? That's how you play in a playground. Now, y'all, please tell me, how in the world are you supposed to play on this? There's no one right way. If a child wants to come and they want to go up that way and then go over another and then swing to another, that's fine. If a kid wants to just hop along all of it, that's fine. If they want to climb over all of it, that's fine. If they just want to swing around it, that's fine. This allows them to express themselves. And I've come to realize these are popping up all over the place. And I still have no earthly idea what you're really supposed to do with it, but that's because the architects don't want there to be one way. But this is that postmodern idea. There's not a one right playground anymore. It's a jumbled mess. And you play on it however you want to play on it. Now here's the next thing I want you to do. I want you to think with me, what should a building look like? Now again, this is postmodern architecture. Postmodern architecture, I really don't know where the lines are. That's because they've gotten rid of lines. Linear thinking, it's left postmodernism. Lines are no longer a part of it. Anything that you can do to get around the straight, logical thinking, that's what postmodernism has done. And buildings like this are popping up everywhere. This is the postmodern architecture. A neat story behind this. A couple years ago, I had a student in my class who was an architecture major. And I know nothing about architecture. But I asked her to do a speech on architecture because she was so passionate about it. And she had decided to do modern architecture versus postmodern architecture. Excellent speech. I think she got an A on it. But at the end of the speech, I asked her, I said, so what do you prefer? Do you prefer modern architecture or postmodern architecture? Guess her answer. Postmodern. Her rationale? I can do whatever I want. And that just, it made so much sense. Whenever she told me, I prefer postmodern architecture, not because it creates prettier buildings, not because it's better for society, not because it's better in any way, but it allows me to create whatever I want to create. There's no rules. However I want to create that building, I can create it. Now again, I think this helps us to understand many of the limitations of postmodernism. You're still going to have standards of safety. You're still going to have standards of building, which is one of the many reasons postmodernism fails. But the reason it's growing is it allows me to do with whatever I want. Now, final one. I want you to imagine with me, what is the most beautiful painting you've ever seen? It's the most beautiful painting you've ever seen. So for me, I'm a Thomas Kincaid fan. Jessica and I have up in our home a few Thomas Kincaid pieces, not real ones, we're not that rich. But there's one that's from a Christmas scene of them walking down the street. Snow's falling, there's a big gathering of people. That's whenever I think of a beautiful painting. That's what I think of. Now, what does postmodern art look like? Now, Brother Bill, you told me who Mephibosheth was. I want you to tell me what this painting is. I'm just kidding, Brother Bill. Someone tried to explain it to me once what this means. But again, y'all, there's not one meaning of this. And here's what we can do. If I were to go to Brother Bill's home and I were to see this up, I, according to postmodernism, could not say, Bill, my Thomas Kincaid painting is better than yours. Because that's exclusive. Because I'm trying to say that one type of painting is better than another. Again, God says, me or all the other gods. Bel says, no God is better than any other God. We're all the same. But I can go to his house and say, Bill, that may not be my thing, but so long as it makes you happy, that's great. Now, I recognize, y'all, there's nothing inherently moral about art. But I'm trying to illustrate a concept here. If Bill wants to put this up in his home, I guess Romans 14 would allow you to do so. I still think it's really bad judgment. But that's the postmodern concept. There's no meaning behind this. There's no one inherent meaning behind this. It's whatever meaning I want to give to it, however it makes me feel, however it makes me want to do. Meaning is not in the painting. Meaning is in me and whatever I want to give to it. Like with Bel. God says, I have a law that you must follow. Meaning is in my law. Bel says, meaning is in whatever you give to me. Meaning is in yourself. That's what postmodernism has done. But now, how does this apply to spiritual matters? I recognize it's a bit humorous to look at a playground, and I know that y'all are going to go and look on Glenarvan and find that for me. Send me a picture. And I know that it's humorous to think about buildings, and it's humorous to think about art. But do we remember what God's response to Bel was? Whenever God responded to Bel in the book of Numbers, you remember what he did to the chiefs? He hanged them. When we got to Jehu, what did Jehu do? He killed them. When we got to Hosea, what did Hosea do? Led them into captivity. And while it may be humorous to look at these things and to recognize how ludicrous they may be, the spiritual implications of postmodernism have eternal consequences. What are some ways that postmodernism has created threats to Christianity? The first, and I would say this is perhaps the biggest one, is with sexual orientation. Used to, according to even a modernist mentality, you were either male or female, right? You were either male or female. Postmodernism says, oh no, you are not to have either male or female. Let's tear down the structure. You're whatever gender you want to be. I'm in grad school with some people who study gender studies. They claim there's up to, the last I heard was 9 genders. 9 different genders. There's not just male or female anymore. There's all different types of genders. Why did Caitlyn Jenner get such huge support? Because really, I would say, he's the champion of that postmodern mentality. Bruce Jenner didn't want to be a man, so he can give himself his own gender. He can give himself his own meaning. He can give himself his own identity. And he can give himself whatever he wants to be. And according to postmodernism, that's fine. But what's the only thing I'm not supposed to do? I'm not supposed to be exclusive. And I'm not supposed to say that's wrong. So you can do and you can be and you can create whatever you want to do, just so long as you don't judge me for it. And brethren, I am truly concerned with how great an impact this type thinking is making on the church. We may think that we're immune to this. Jessica and I counted a few weeks ago. I think we've known of around 10 people that we went to Florida College with who have become homosexual since then. Florida College. People that we went to church with. One that I was very, very good friends with. They created their own identities. They created their own genders. They created their own sexual orientations. Y'all, we must recognize God has called us. You're either male or you're female. One man for one woman for life. That's the law of God. Or be a eunuch for the kingdom of God. We can't create our own identities. We can't create our own orientations. That's what Bel wants us to think. And ultimately, I would say that's what Satan wants us to think. Well, what else? What about biblical interpretation? How many times have we heard something to the effect of, well, Ryan, that may be what the Bible means to you, but that's just not what it means to me. That's how Bel would read the Bible. Bel would say, there's many ways to read the Bible. There's many truths, but whatever meaning you give to it, that's the meaning you need to follow. So if you come away from the Bible and you think that, the Bible's telling you that you should, just pursue money and pursue wealth and pursue any type of pleasure that you have and just go on with it, that's great. Just make sure that's what you follow and be true to yourself. But if you read from it and you think you need to be in the Church of Christ and be here 3 times a week and live a holy life and do your Bible reading, that's great. But again, that's your own meaning. That's your own life. Don't judge me for it. That's the meaning I've given to it. A few others. What about views of Jesus? Was Jesus the Son of God? Was he a prophet? Was he a man? Who is Jesus? When we look at who Jesus was the Son of God. Period. End of discussion. That's who Jesus was. But now, our society wants to claim, oh, no. That's who you see Jesus as, but there's still many other things that you can see Jesus as. That's the postmodern interpretation of Jesus. What about when it comes to worship? We have many different movements. You worship the way that you best see fit. Worship the way that best suits you, and worship the way that's most true to yourself. If that means instruments, if that means applause, if that means anything that you want, if that means we bring in pizza for the Lord's Supper, if that means we do it on Saturday, if you think you can worship Jesus best in the middle of the field, naked at midnight, that's the way you should worship Jesus. Now, that may sound ludicrous, but I cannot tell you how many people I go to grad school with who that is their view of religion. That if anything you come up with, be true to yourself, but that's all that matters. What about morality? This is, again, I think, one that we really have to be aware of. Perhaps, whenever my grandparents were growing up, there was a clearer standard of right-wrong. Fornication, for example. My grandmother and I have discussed this before. And there were certainly people who had premarital sex. I mean, of course, there was sin. But there was a greater line between the two. Now there's no line. Whatever sexual escapades you want to go in, be true to yourself, make yourself happy, but that's the greatest that could be. What about whenever it comes to non-Christian empowerment? Let me explain what I mean by this one. Follow me just 1 second. logically. According to postmodernism, there's no truth. Truth is not something that exists in the mind of God. Truth's not objective. Truth's not eternal. Truth is whatever you make of it. What then is the rule of postmodernism? What's the standard of postmodernism? I'm going to simplify this and do it really quickly. According to postmodernism, if truth does not come from the mind of God, the way that we should create societal rules is by looking at those who have had underprivileged voices. And this concept here of that underprivileged mentality has then become the rule by which we are to make decisions. Now, in some cases, I think this is something I'm glad has been brought about. It's brought about some of the injustices within society. But when it comes to religion, what many in our society would claim is the people who should be listened to most are those who are underprivileged, the underrepresented voices, those who had meta-discursive behaviors, who had meta-narratives, that's the terms they use, and the people who are non-Christians, those should be the ones that we should empower. So why then is there such a war on Christianity in this country? Well, it's ultimately because of postmodernism. What postmodernism has said is there's no truth, so what we should do is listen to those who didn't have represented voices. And if we listen to those who didn't have represented voices within the terms of religion, what that ultimately means is Christianity was the major world religion of thought in the Western world for 2,000 years, so now we have to listen to the pagans, to the atheist, to any other type of religion you want to put in there, and make them happy. Now, y'all, I could go on with this with many more examples. But what I would urge you to do is look for these examples of this lack of structure, this lack of meaning, this giving meaning to yourself. Another example, the Harlem Shake. I thought this was just a perfect example of postmodernism. I'm sure many of y'all will remember on Facebook, I don't remember how long ago it was now, but people were getting on YouTube and they were making videos where, at one point in the first 10 seconds of the video, they were just beating their head or something real simple. But then in the last half of the video, it just turned into really loud music and chaos. That, to me, was the most perfect example of the modern versus postmodern mentalities that I've seen. Because that's what postmodernism is leading us to. It's leading us to a society of chaos. It's leading us to a society of personal fulfillment. It's leading us to a society that has lost Jesus, that has lost God, and has replaced God with Baal. And it's not my concern, ultimately, what American government does and what American society does. But as a Christian and as an individual, we have to be aware of this, and we have to be aware of the consequences. Whenever we look at how God treated Baal worship in the Old Testament, it was severe. And if we allow ourselves to fall into this mentality and allow this postmodern mentality to take over our minds, to take over our brains, and to take over our spirit, ultimately it's going to lead us down the same path. Very briefly then, how do we respond? One passage and then we'll close. Hosea chapter 13 and verse 4. Hosea chapter 13 and verse 4. Going back to the book of Hosea, Hosea told the people, in the light of Baal, in the light of what you're suffering. Verse 4, but I am the Lord your God from the land of Egypt. You know no God but me, and besides me there is no Savior. Y'all, this is my appeal to you. Know no God but Jesus, because beside him there is no Savior. Get out your songbooks, please.
Voice of the Savior says, come, the cross where he died is
Inside.